I will repeat very briefly a section of the lecture that we were dealing with a week ago and indicate that C.G. Jung gave, as far as I know, his first lecture dealing with the subject of what now is called spirituality, but for a few thousand years was called religion, by a lecture in the 1920s in London. I have a pamphlet of the original lecture somewhere, but I felt that it wasn't necessary at this time to give you all the details, but if you are, I can find the precise details for you, where it was given, what date, what time, and so forth. And what this amounted to was that the new psychology, or psychoanalysis, as it was most frequently called at that time, had the reputation, not entirely undeserved, of being pretty anti-religion. You must remember this was a time, unlike now, where the common consensus is anti-religion. And you have to be called, I don't know what, some kind of a terrible person if you are religious. So allow me to introduce myself to you as a terrible person. In any event, Sigmund Freud, as we know, was quite openly, without any disguise or difficulty or shame, was opposed to religion. Since I studied his life for my livelihood for about 3 years one time, or maybe even a little longer, I came across the fact that this attitude, anti-religious attitude, diminished in Sigmund Freud. When he was up alone in his apartment in England, in London, having been ransomed from the Nazis by his disciple Princess Marie Bonaparte, he became much more tolerant of just about everybody, with the exception of Nazis, which is understandable. In any event, by contrast, C.G. Jung, being a son of a preacher, a grandson of a preacher, and having, as I mentioned last time, I see no more than 9 people in the active ministry at the time of his childhood. And I always say how the boy survived that many preachers, I shall never know, but he did. You know, Sigmund Freud, on the other hand, had an inquiring attitude about religion, and if anybody could say with a good deal of veracity that he was spiritual rather than just religious from his early life on, that I think would be a very accurate statement. But of course, in those days, they did not use those expressions. In any event, it took till he was a medical doctor. He had been associated with Freud, written all kinds of books, and traveled to some parts of the world, that he decided that if they wished him to do so, that he would give as complete a statement of his own point of view toward religion as he could. And so he was invited by an association, the exact name of which does not come to my aged consciousness, but which was a British association of clergy. and which was organized, I believe, by the Church of England, and mostly had as its attendees clergymen of the Church of England, and eventually, in part owing to Jung's participation, it became quite an illustrious organization. There too, I cannot remember the name of the organization, but if I don't give it to you in another week or so, then call the Jung Institute. I'm sure they have a complete file of the little booklets that were issued by this organization, and which have, among other things, Jung's famous lecture entitled The Symbolic Life. And really, this is one of those rare occasions in the history of a great scholar and lecturer wherein the title, the announced title of a lecture or of a booklet or something of that sort, actually describes the content of the lecture. I know I have come up at times with wild titles that had very little to do with the content, and then I had to decide, well, is the title more important or the content more important? And I'm sorry to tell you, to your great disappointment, that often I felt that the title was more important, because it's the title that will bring people to the lecture. With the content, they are already stuck when they are there. And I also mentioned, I think last time, and I'll mention now again, even at the cost of being repetitious, that I had he became really a very good friend toward the end of his life, a British physician, who then became a Jungian analyst, and who was a prominent theosophist by birth, by the name of Dr. Lawrence Bendit. Now, Dr. Bendit was a lifetime theosophist. He was born into the Theosophical Society, and then he married a lady who probably, next to Geoffrey Hodgson, was the most prominent, how should we call it? It's a term that is not regarded very highly nowadays, psychic or intuitive or clairvoyant, Phoebe Payne Bendit. A very interesting lady also. Now, Dr. Bendit had early specialized in psychiatry and was very interested in the teachings of Jung, but as he told me, I think this particular lecture, or maybe a lecture before it, were the first ones that Jung delivered in the English language in England, period. And so he obviously went, and he said that all kinds of psychologists and psychiatrists have been coming there and giving talks, and one was more boring than the other. They all had very heavy German accents, and when it was all said and done, they didn't say too much. But that when this man, broad-shouldered, heavy, strong Swiss countryman walked into the hall, he said, I knew that this is going to be different, and it was. And that was Jung's lecture. So I believe I am not fabricating something, that this lecture on the symbolic life was probably the very first lecture given to others than at the universities by C.G. Jung in England, but I could also be wrong, which in itself is not a mortal sin. Those are the surrounding circumstances of the lecture. Now, let's try to put the lecture into context. Jung was, for considerable time, after all, being a preacher's son, being among church people a lot, and having been, I think, by that time, highly honored by His late Holiness Pope Pius XII with a congratulatory letter in which the Pope thanked him for all the good that he had done for so many members of the Catholic Church who, without Jung's intervention, would assuredly have fallen away from the faith. So the Pope thanked him for keeping some Catholics in the church. It's a rather unusual circumstance, but it definitely did happen. And so obviously his reputation in religious circles was rising, and therefore the lecture in London was in many ways a unique event. Now, that being said in advance, we need to keep in mind just a little bit, because time passes so quickly, and as the Gnostics said, time is a counterfeit of eternity. So there's always, at least I found that to be true, there's always something wrong with time. Either it's too fast, or it's too slow, or something or the other, but there's always something a bit wrong with time. So it's one of those conundrums of life where one has to hold up one's own position and really look at the issue as heavily and as profoundly as one can, in order not to come into erroneous statements and theories. Now, that being a general statement, we now need to keep in mind that the title of the symbolic life was a very unusual one, and probably to some people a rather peculiar and off-putting one in the 1920s. In the 1960s, it would just have been put off as something else influenced by the New Age or something of that sort. But at that time, it was a very unusual title. So I am not surprised that a good many British clergymen, I don't think there were any Anglican lady priests yet, came to it, and it really increased Jung's regard in British religious circles. So what we need to keep in mind that the bold assertion that religion has to do with symbols, that the religious life equals symbolic life, upon which Jung's lecture was based, was undoubtedly a matter of some bewilderment and confusion on the part of the assembled clergymen, and maybe even remained such later on. Nevertheless, within the context of Jung's thought, really the subject matter of the lecture is well explained in the title itself. Because Jung was of the view, and I certainly agree with him, that what has become to religion, especially the Christian religion in the Western world, over the last few hundred years and maybe even before, has been a turning of the investigative and devotional focus of the people in the religious field to subject matters which had, in essence, very little to do with religion. Are we getting a little cold? No? I'm still all right. Anyway, whatever we are doing is all right. When we start shivering and shaking and the pieces of ice will form on the ceiling, then we'll do something else. In any event, the value, the nature, and the function of symbols was very badly, if at all, understood in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. I don't know why, but that was the case. Probably because coming with the 19th century, a baleful wind, a terrible sirocco of mind-drying opinion of the scientific world enveloped, at least the academic world in the West, within the context of which the symbolic was not recognized as anything real. The symbolic, if anything, was regarded to some extent within the context of the representative arts, because it would be very difficult to deal with the great Renaissance painters and sculptors, for instance, without the recognition that their subject matter is of symbolic nature or symbolic nature. But on the whole, the symbolic was not considered real. In fact, back in our days, I can't quite remember now the author, I think it was a psychological author, sort of in the 60s, did write a fairly interesting book called The Symbolic and the Real, sort of contrasting the two. But even that, I think it was a Jungian, even that sort of states that the symbolic is not real, and what is real is not symbolic. However, all of this, of course, very greatly changed in the 1960s, primarily by way of Jung's influence, and secondarily with some of the teachers that came over from the East, from India and Japan, with Zen Buddhism and so forth, wherein the recognition of what might be called symbolic reality was present all the time. Now we have to put this into a context, because while I have somewhere stashed away among all my printed material, I have somewhere stashed away the little book which contains Jung's lecture on the symbolic life. I think it will be better to extract from it some of the main ideas in order to allow it to be better understood. And here, let's say, the general picture that Jung had in mind, and that he was putting forth to a kind of sort of emission, all these solemn-faced gentlemen in clerical dark suits with high collars and probably with pince-nez and other curious things on their nose, namely all these aging and but very self-conscious British clergymen. They were the ones to whom he was bringing this forth. And what he implied right at the beginning was that the purpose of religion is not what is going on at that particular time in religion. The purpose of religion, and even most churchmen and churchwomen nowadays would contradict that. the purpose of religion is not to believe anything. The purpose of religion ultimately is to know something. And that knowing in turn, at least in our cultural period, maybe not quite the same fashion in earlier or later periods, is none other than the awareness of and the interaction with symbols. Now, what is a symbol? It's like so many of these terms, it's a Greek term, sim, together, bolion, meaning put together. So it literally means something that has been put together. Not a very promising name for anything. Now, however, when we look at it a little further and deeper, then we can recognize why it is an appropriate expression and an appropriate subject within this context to study. Because what the indication is here, that there are various ways at any given time in history and in any given culture, there are a variety of ways that people will approach reality. And the principal reason for that is that there are a variety of people around. You wouldn't want them to be thinking the same way. They all would vote the same way. Now, wouldn't that be just a terror a little while from now? But in any event, because of this reason, we have, whether we admit it or not, whether we are fully conscious of it or not, we have an innate search for something more real than is available to us. In religion, we call that the search for God, or for the gods in a polytheistic culture, and so forth. And it would seem, would be indicated by historical research, that it has existed in the human race for an exceedingly long time, probably as long as the human race itself. However, there came a time, primarily the 19th century, which Jung himself had called the Dark Ages. Generally the earlier Middle Ages is referred to by historians as the Dark Ages, but the Dark Ages in the sense that those elements of recognition, of realization, of what now we call more widely consciousness, which can bring the deeper and perhaps the deepest insights from the depths of the psyche, as we would say psychologically, that these kinds of openings, these kinds of insights are made available to us not by the scientific method, not by externally and scientifically verifiable facts, but by certain intuitive recognitions which are of a non-factual nature, but which nevertheless are capable of opening up insights and wisdom and ultimately psychological changes, psychological transformations, what Jung himself came to call individuation of a major nature which the others do. So Jung came to London with the conviction, based on his own empirical evidence with patients, which was already of some considerable length of time at that time. Jung came with the conviction that in order to derive a certain special kind of knowing, which perhaps I don't think he would have owned up to it at that time, although maybe later, identical with the word gnosis, unless one found avenues of cognition, avenues of knowledge, avenues of the Greek would call knowledge gnosis of a different kind. If one found that, then one was on the way to a more promising and ultimately probably all-important kind of knowing, and that such knowing could be obtained, and the way that we would come to such knowing, at least initially, but in many ways even subsequently, is by way of dealing with the symbols of the human mind. Now, symbols are not invented by anyone. We can say, oh well, there are certain symbols of Hinduism, mandalas and this and that, and other symbols somewhere else, but that is not the issue. Is that there are certain kinds of insight which are processed by our consciousness in certain ways, which bring forth a wisdom, an insight far greater and far more revealing and helpful than the means that we may have employed until that time. And the way the Greeks, I think, figured this, although I don't have access to the wisdom of the ancient Greeks, except for, like you do too, through some books. But let us say the Greeks' point of view was that when one employed symbolic reality, when one employed the symbols of their traditions, the symbols of the ancients, when one employed symbolic knowledge and symbolic thinking, one would attain to a kind of knowledge that with other means was not available. And if Jung were asked why wasn't it available, he would say that it was not available because in order to come to this kind of symbolic wisdom, one had to first do what the word itself says, to put things together. So what are the things we are putting together? Some deep insight producing knowing with available intuitive resources. In other words, something needs to be employed that certainly was looked down upon in the scientific era of the 19th century, and that something is none other than imagination. Actually, Freud and his associates were aware of that already, because, for instance, one of the first journals that Jung edited, not Jung, but that Freud edited in Vienna, was called Imago, image. And so that because Freud already was aware that in order for what he had discovered, we have to give him credit for that, the unconscious, the part of our mind that is ordinarily not in our conscious awareness, if we want to bring that out into consciousness and to employ it for the benefit of our conscious lives, we need to employ our imagination. And imagination in turn is a practice, shall we say, that certainly has been with humanity since the world began, but only came to be known under that name, the Latin name imaginatio, the image-making faculty of the mind. So how can we pull these together? We can pull them together by saying that once how would that be best? Once the human psyche, the human mind, psyche is just word for soul, has sort of outgrows the limitations of extraversion and of exclusive preoccupation with the outer world. Jung very early discovered that. He said, an extroverted people, extroverted culture will never come to deeper truths. Why? Because its focus is ever outside of itself. And that is unfortunate. Up to a certain point, it's all right to do that, but not when it becomes the substitute for everything else. And therefore, there must be a recognition of the extroverted and psychoanalytically, we might say, ego-directed movements of the mind to a deeper stratum. I am just sort of describing a little bit fantastically what Jung was really saying. And what he was saying was that once you begin to withdraw the focus of your consciousness from outer things and from external events and even other people, then eventually you are likely to touch a point in your inside, in your psyche, that is of a different nature. And this is the intuitive would be able to be used as far as the functions of the psyche are concerned, but it is more than that. This is the recognition, let us say, of the deeper unconscious. You can call it, some of it you can call the archetypal psyche, you can call it by various names, but now you penetrate a realm of the unconscious which ordinarily was not available to you. And when you do that, then all kinds of interesting things can happen. One of them being that, I'm tempted to say that religion is born, but that's a temptation that I'm trying to unsuccessfully resist. I do that sort of thing. But in any event, what we are dealing with, therefore, is a recognition comes into the psyche that there is something else, something greater, something more insightful, something wiser, something that can extend the consciousness into a much, much wider area and come to important and ultimately very fruitful recognitions. One of the functions that eventually would ensue as the result of such a process would be what Jung came to call individuation. Because it's a Latinate word that he nevertheless picked from the German, because an individuum in German means a special person, a separate person, somebody who stands on his own mind and his own consciousness. And one of the difficulties that Jung, and that was now not a recognition of Freud, that Jung recognized quite early in his career was that people may be of good character, they may be well educated, they may be mannerly and polite to each other, all kinds of good things. But one thing very few of them have. And what is that? Unity, unification. They don't act as unified beings. They act as beings that are divided. There is their emotional self, there is their intuitive self, there is their sensate self, and these selves, which originally were often called, and you must have come across that term somewhere, autonomous complexes. And these autonomous complexes keep the individual from being able to use a very common expression, to get it all together. That we are really here with a task of getting it together, namely to unify our autonomous complexes and thereby become a unified individual, an individuum, which really means an indivisible self, which, however, is a pretty difficult accomplishment. Yet it is a very important one. And now it is at this point of the transformation process, or whatever we wish to call it. I don't like the term, but that's probably just a personal predilection of mine. I don't like the term of just a psychological or a spiritual growth. I'm not a tree that grows. Maybe I would be happy as a tree until they come and cut me down. But the issue is that our change to a unified being, a psychologically, spiritually unified being, is not a matter of growth. I grow this many centimeters today and that many tomorrow, and up, and then finally I'm going to break into leaves and will probably have flowers and things of that sort. That's not what it is all about. It's not a good metaphor. The better metaphor is one that probably very few people will discover, because it requires being exposed to being exposed, for instance, to silkworms. Now, how many of us here have had a deep and powerful spiritual experience with silkworms? I don't think so, but it can be. And by poor happenstance, some neighbors of mine where I lived as a child were growing mulberry trees. And the mulberry trees are the chief delicacy of the silkworm. If he can eat mulberry leaves, he'll be very happy. So, not to get too wormy here, but let's just say, as time went on, you got the eggs for the silkworms. They were sent to us by the government because they wanted to have silk, Hungary to produce silk. I don't think they succeeded terribly well. The Chinese and the Japanese were always better at it. But in any event, the issue was that the production of silkworms would be beneficial to the common good. And so what happens, here are the little wormies, once they come out of their eggs, on the mulberry tree, chomping away like heck, get out. You know, those little critters, where they're eating, they can make so much noise, it's absolutely amazing. they make more noise than a Hungarian farmer eating a plate of goulash. And anyway, they're chomp, 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 chomp. And after they have eaten their fill and grown to a bigger size and all of that, then they spin themselves into a cocoon and sit inside of the cocoon until they are ready to come out of it. Now, here is the symbolically, since we are talking about symbols, the symbolically important issue. And the symbolically important issue is that when the silkworm emerges from the cocoon that he had been spinning, he looks and acts and eats and sleeps and moves around like an entirely different being from the one that had been spinning the cocoon to begin with. You wouldn't believe it that it is the same creature. And what has happened? Well, what has happened was that the worm the silkworm in this case, has changed into a winged creature, like a mini butterfly, a moth of sorts. Entirely different, and as it comes forth, and then we took these moths and packed them up in a scientifically organized boxes and then sent them to the government laboratory, because these creatures with the wings and so forth, they are the ones who will make further silkworms and who are also involved in the spinning of the substance, although of course already the worms had too. So what we have is inside the cocoon of the silkworm, and I got to get off this wormy subject. What you get is an example, an eminent example, undeniable example of what? Of transformation. This is not growth, this is transformation. What was there is no longer there. Something else is there. It has been transformed into that. And in certain ways, this is what metaphorically and certainly symbolically Jung indicates that the human being needs to do. We can't stay the way we are. We have to transform. We have to become something new. And that something new, in turn, as he mentions quite early in his lecture in London, what we need to recognize is that we were somehow brought, sent here in order to transform. And then, of course, if you want to ask yet further, then you can also ask, well, what will that transformation that you are destined to undergo be good for? What it will be good for, says Jung, is that only thus transformed will the human being become akin to its mysterious origins. And this reflects itself into religion, that when we transform, when we change into what we are supposed to change, then we are close to what the monotheistic religions call God, and the others would possibly call the gods. So that on the untransformed human mind isn't going anywhere. It's like a horse that is waiting to be mounted. It will with its hoofs, it will scratch the ground, but it's not going anywhere. in order to go anywhere, it has to change in a particular way. And that particular way is a way of transformation. Now, in order for such transformation to take place, certain powerful stimuli have to come. Because certainly if we go around in the world and see various people and investigate different cultures and things like that, we don't see a lot of people who are transformed or who are in the way of thus transforming. It's supposed to happen, at least according to Jung, but it isn't happening. And that's right there is a conundrum. Now what are these? Now we are coming to the subject matter itself. How can this person that is trying to become an undivided person, an individuum, as we call it in German, how can it be stimulated in order to transform? And that is where Jung brings in that at least at the time when he delivered that lecture, about 100 years ago, not so terribly long ago, at least at that time, the principal useful stimulator of that sort was to become involved in what he then came to call the symbolic life. So we are not just dealing with buying of couple of, there are very nice books available, I have some of them, on symbols. It's not just studying the textbook meaning of symbols, but rather it is to begin to think in a symbolic fashion, to bring forth from the depth of the psyche, where after all of these processes start, because the life of the human is the life of the soul. And soul in Greek is called psyche, in Latin it's called animus. Those are the, well, I could tell it to you in Hungarian and German and so forth, but you wouldn't be interested. When it is thus discovered, then it can be exposed to the kind of stimuli that will make it transform and come into its own. So let's say now if we change this to a religious scenario, then what is taking place is that divinity, God, whatever you want to call him, has placed us here in a position with certain potentials which would, if properly pursued, would lead us into the presence and ultimately perhaps the union with the divine. And of course this is pretty Gnostic, because that is just about what the old Gnostics said, that we came from the transcendental, and once we become familiar with the transcendental again, once we transform sufficiently to be affinitized to that, then we will be admitted, shall we say, into the higher states of consciousness. And as the Jungian psychology developed, various details of this came to be disclosed. One of them that in the human, these are, again, metaphorical expressions are always difficult, but let us say that in each and every human being is the potential of superhumanity. Now I am not invoking Friedrich Nietzsche here with the Superman, but let's say a human potential that we haven't experienced before. But like all potentials, it was there within us, all along. And it was various stimuli that allowed it to come forth and to become active. So, and how is this accomplished? What is there here to stimulate this kind of transformation? Religion. And Jung very correctly, and like a good Latin and Greek scholar, which his generation was, those people, my father's generation, they knew their ancient languages, boy, like that, and certainly Jung was one of them, but Freud was too. They were classically educated people. But in any event, whatever the classical education may have been, the issue is here that we are in the process of transforming into something much bigger, not physically bigger necessarily, much wiser, much kinder, much more insightful, much more capable of foretelling even the future and cutting across the boundaries of time. We are capable of all of these, but we must come to exercise that capacity. And what is keeping us from that? Well, I leave it up to each one of you, but I would say that at least in the 20th and the 21st century, because this lecture was still given in the 20th, but let's say in the new centuries, what is the problem is that we are stuck in corners, and I was trying to use the German word Winkel, which is sort of a bad term of a piece of cloth, reality, because we are still, in spite of what has happened in history and in spite of the really great opportunities that by now have come our way in terms of developing consciousness, we are still very much stuck in the conviction that our knowledge, our wisdom, our accomplishments, our good and useful deeds all must be accomplished outside of ourselves, over there. And as long as that underlying attitude exists, I would venture a suggestion that the kind of change, the kind of transformation that we really need, that becoming one, not because when we become one, we become one not only with ourselves, but with something that throughout history the various religions have called God. Because the potential that sits within us, quietly waiting for its opportunity to come forth, is a divinity. It is what the ancients would have, which is one of the beings the ancient Greeks would have conceived of when they walked by Mount Olympus, and they could, in the clouds, in the mist, from the mist and the clouds, the sounds came out. The gods were laughing. The gods were laughing. Why were they laughing? Because they were gods and they could afford to laugh. You see, and I don't think that we are. But let us say, in other words, there is a potential future for the human being. And using some words that Madame Blavatsky used at one time, the growth and splendor of which have no limit. That is the potential that is within us. And yet, No. We go after this, we go after that. We are in love with our computer, we are in love with our, what is it called, the stupid telephone? No, it's a little bit of a turnaround and things of that sort. And the real potential is not allowed to come forth. So that here is the purpose of religion. The purpose is religion to facilitate a powerful and lasting and ultimately tremendously beneficial change in the human mind, in the human soul, that is for the better and that would assure the growth, the transformation rather of consciousness and its the development of its great capacity once it is turned. And so what can facilitate that? What can facilitate it, said Jung, I imagine to the great consternation of the Anglican clergy, he said that what facilitates that is that there is an indwelling principle, deeply hidden within the human. And this indwelling principle, which probably is equivalent to what anciently was called the spirit, when sufficiently brought into action and facilitated, brings the human into a state of being which he hasn't experienced before, but which can be supremely beneficial to the individual human and to humanity. Namely, that a transformative process can take place where an indwelling potential, a mysterious indwelling potential, which Jung came to call the self with a capital S, the Selbst in German, which when released really brings forth into an operative manifestation a spiritual essence. In fact, that's what Madame Blavatsky called it, in the human, which can be of immense power, of immense benefit, and can change not only the individual human being, but can change humanity into something greater. Because we need to keep in mind also that when we study religion in a comparative sense, let's say that's what I was supposed to teach for a number of years in school, then we find that there is an underlying common feature. There is a secret that once we investigate the situation deeply enough, that is in some fashion present in all the religions. And this secret commodity, this secret thing that is there, is capable of transforming, capable of bringing moral goodness into the individual, creating beauty, all kinds of things of that sort, but it needs to be stimulated. And what Jung expressed in this particular lecture, and say I have here many pages, as I announced last time, that I took when I was first dealing with that lecture, and one of these days I'm going to give you more quotations from it and so forth. But that's not really that important. But somehow there is an underlying recognition of in humanity that I can be more, I can be wise, I can be good. And as the result of having developed all of these capacities, I can be ultimately happy. I am the heir of, as Krishnamurti called it once a kingdom of happiness. Now, that's a big statement because we all would like to have that, but we probably don't want to knock ourselves out too much in order to gain it, and then consequently not all that much happens. But kind of something is coming up my brain. Oh yes, something that was told to me by a teacher of mine, was a Cistercian monk in Hungary, so I must have been less than 16 years old, because that is when I left my home country. And he told me that this happened to him when he was about my age. But he also pretty much swore me to secrecy. People always do that with me. No, I tell you this, but don't you tell it to anybody else. Don't you? Okay. In any event, he was walking down in northern Hungary, not terribly far from where I grew up. He was walking down a country road, and he came to what we had many of them on the roads, particularly at the crossroads. We would have a crucifix, pretty large, not life-size, but the crucifix itself with the body on it, probably about as tall as a man. Anyway, he came there and he was praying in front of the crucifix when some strange change came upon him, and he became conscious of himself as being on the cross rather than in front of it, which, needless to say, scared my good friend considerably. And so I said, what am I going to do? I'm going to stand here now like the wooden crucifix on the crossroads. So usually he went home. And on the way home, sort of came to him really the whole inspiration for his life. He said that I became aware that I am crucified. What do you mean? Well, I said that I am crucified in this world. I am crucified in this body. Here is the cross of the body. But that if I do things as I am instructed, and if I can close to God again, and I will be taken from that cross. And then he went through the sort of the major events of the Easter story of they take Jesus off the cross. He says, I felt they were taking me off the cross. They took me to the grave. I went around, I went to the underworld, I came back, and I found that somehow this image of our Lord Christ, it's right here. It's in me. And he remembered some things that he had learned, like there's a famous verse of Angelus Silesius, the medieval mystics, if Christ 1,000 times in Bethlehem be born, but not in thee, thy soul is all forlorn. The cross at Golgotha standeth up in vain, unless in thee it be erect again. And that this is the imitatio Christi, that we have to undergo a powerful internal change, and that to us in the Christian world, the example, the archetype, as Jung would call it, for that image to follow, was given in the chief figure of the Christian faith. Now, Jung, although he was a preacher's son and all of that, he was very universal. He studied all religions. He did many things along that line. But he also said that we have within us someone who is trying to rise from the tomb. And that rising from the tomb is another metaphor for becoming one. the divine in us will become with the human outside of us. And when we have that, then we have authentically undergone the individuation, because it is that individual, that is the divine individual, that we are destined to become. By the way, don't think that this is some kind of a Swiss heresy, although that they had enough of them with John Calvin over there. Oh, I tell you, what a horrible man of religion that was. And not only that, but he tormented those poor Swiss. And then he sent his disciples over to America. And here they were killing the witches, or the people whom they designated as witches. This is all John Calvin's offspring. But let us say, I better not say too much, because we have the biggest and the fanciest Presbyterian church in Los Angeles, just down the road on Gower Street. And if these Presbyterians, who are of course the followers of John Calvin, they hear what I say, and they might burn me like Calvin burned Michael Servetus in Geneva, Very wonderful man of religion. He is a guy who was his best friend for a long time. And then Calvin decided that Servetus was a heretic. I think he denied the Trinity or something of that sort. So Calvin, who was the dictator of Geneva, had him burned at the stake. And when his best friend Michael was crying to him, Jean, please take me off, I'm burning. He said, oh no. He said, that is good for your soul. These are the founders of some of our religious denominations. And it is really kind of peculiar, isn't it? But let us say the issue here being that there is a way out of all of these terrible things. But, and this is very difficult for people to approach, that way, that highway, that staircase, whatever metaphor we want to use, out of this terrible situation, this difficult, terrible world, the way out of it is through ourselves. When we come close to ourselves, when we have moved in the way that we now begin to recognize that there is a greater self within us, that this is possible, and that the great archetypal beings like Jesus Christ and others, Virgin Mary, Sophia of the Gnostics, that these are all here waiting for us, so that we will make the move and start walking on the road to become whole. And Jung said, if you look at the religions, Christian religions, and he was quite interested in Catholicism. That is why the Pope was so laudatory of him. He said, yes, we have to rise above our externally oriented humanity. We have to discover, which is properly called, this is one of the greatest archetypes of all religions. This is the Christ in us. The Christ in us, the hope of glory that St. Paul spoke about. And that what is necessary for that is sacrament. In his time, this should give you a little indication of what is going on in the field of religion. And so I'll very quickly tell you, when Jung was young, he counseled a lot of patients who were Roman Catholics, and they all were cured according to the people involved in this, they all were cured in a much shorter time than others. And so the Vatican, I don't know, I think the Pope Pius was there. The Vatican, this is factual. The Vatican contacted Jung and said, how come you're doing so much better with our Catholics than you do with others? Yeah? And Jung wrote back, yes, because you have the confession. In other words, you already have a practice that leads in the direction in which I am trying to lead people to discover themselves. And therefore, they are almost done by the time they come to me, he said. You can be sure that the Vatican was very happy. But I'll also throw in something a little bit nasty. You know what? He would not get that answer today. He would not be able to give that answer today because the Catholic Church is going through one of its worst deteriorating phases in its 2,500-year history. Because the Church itself is cutting its own throat. And you know what? That's not a good practice. That's something that you shouldn't do. Leave your throat alone. Yeah. But that is it. When, in other words, the sacramental practice and the way it is explained and the way it is approached, they don't carry the same power. They don't carry the same absolution. They don't carry the same resolving of the internal problems that they used to. And they don't because the priests, because the bishops, and in some cases even a pope or two, have pulled the rug, the spiritual rug from underneath the people. And there they are falling down. So that we also have to watch. So the problem, of course, has been all along that, let's say, there has always been, and Jung says so, there has always been a difference between religion and any particular approach to religion. And what we have now have certain changes, and these changes of approach to religion have gotten us to the point where in the overwhelming majority of people, especially of a younger generation, openly state that they may be spiritual, but they are not religious. Now, what we need to keep in mind to be able to close this, because I am still going to go on with the symbolic life next time, because I see that how I just skirted the outsides of it. So don't be too angry if we come back to this subject, but from a different angle next time. That when you are involved in an effort to reach beyond yourself to the divine, when you are involved in such an effort, which I think knowingly or unknowingly, nolens volens, as we called it in Latin, we know that. We are all reaching out of this pseudo-reality wherein we are. And if we add to this picture, would you like to sit down, folks? Do we still have us?
Yes, we will.
And I think you know where you can find more chairs too. There are at least 3 chairs in my office.
No, we got literally 3.
Okay, good. Because one thing we don't want you to do is to be uncomfortable here. So I meant to say that I think it was the theosophist Johann Jacob van der Leeuw, a Dutchman, very interesting gentleman, who said that we are gods in exile, which is a very good Gnostic statement. And so the issue being that we have an incredible potential within ourselves. But it is not the potential of the conquest of this world. It is not the potential of more computer screens. It is not the potential of more weapons being sent to somewhere else in the world to shoot people. It's the potential of bringing forth kindly, gently, and reverently that incredible being that dwells in us, and which Jung called the Selbst, the self with a capital S, because this is the great self. This is who and what you really are, and you will only know who and what you really are once you have come to that Madame Blavatsky called the essence within you. And this can be gone. And you know, the lovely and wonderful thing is that if we have a good memory, which I no longer have, but if we have a good memory, and if we will notice that there will be certain symbolic events, like will-o'-the-wisps, coming up in the night that will remind you, yes, you have seen me, you have known me, I have talked to you, you know who I am, so start shaping up and doing what you're supposed to do now. This is maybe too colloquial a statement for such a disclosure, but it's there, because so day or night, by sunlight or by the shining of the moon, whether in this part of the world or somewhere else, there is something trying to happen. And this something is trying to reveal itself to us, to you and I. And its revelation is likely to occur by way of symbolism, because one way of putting it is, that's not how Jung put it, although he could have, that the psyche, the soul, has its own language. It has its own responses to stimuli, and when the language in the language of the psyche we get a translation of that higher self, of that self with a capital S that Jung was talking about, then we are on our right way. And so I am convinced, although my convictions have often proven to be false, and they probably still will, but I am convinced that one of the greatest difficulties that had beset the Western world and the Western world with its Christian religion has been that the presence inside of us, the eagerness inside of us that is anxious to come forth and come into its own and become the directing and ruling and blessing and loving counterpart and of our present self, that this has not been adequately explored. Why? Because of those who do not experience this thing can't possibly know what it is. So experience of the divine, experience of the good, as the Greeks would have called it. The experience of transcendence, as Jung would call it in the transcendent function. If we find some of it, if some of it comes to us, it will do its own work. It will clean up the house. It will lead you into the great chamber where the mystery resides. And once you are there, then you don't have to worry about anything. You don't have to worry. And if enough people get there, you don't have to worry about the fate of the world, about the elections, about any of these things, because that incredible transcendental power, which monotheism has shrunk it down to an irascible and unreasonable desert God. That's what monotheism has done. And that desert God in turn has been inherited by Islam. And so there we are so many times a day and say Allah, Allah, Allahu Akbar and so forth. It's calling upon that which is present and which is anxious to come into your soul. But except for some Christian mystics and some of the Sufis, they don't know. And with that, I think I need to lead it over into next time, because Jung also indicated that once this higher self, the true self, the self, when that has been discovered and it has begun to change the individual, then that's not the end. Because once this has come forth, then it will lead you to its own world, to its own consciousness, to those who are like it. And know ye not, says the Gospel of Thomas, know ye not that ye are, or one of the others, know ye not that ye are all angels, that ye are all archangels, that ye are all the great invisible, but you have to come to know it. You have to realize it. You have to make it real and true and active within yourself. And then, as another mystic said, then all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well.
They flew.
Excuse me? Oh, yeah, that they flew. Yeah, you are so good, you have bought it, because otherwise I have to come back with it next time. So here is the thing, we have now, and I'll just allude to it this time, because my good friend had lent this to me, that serious historical research has been done into the strange lives, in this case primarily of Christian mystics and others, even to the point that when we get past this point of reuniting, get past the point of the individuation, then we reach a state of consciousness wherein ecstasies are frequent, wherein the soul, the psyche very, very quickly slips over into another and very different but most powerful world. And in that world, then the individual often, there are many, many records of it, where the individual often is capable, apparent yet a transcendental impulse or command to overcome the laws of nature. And one of the law of gravity being an important one. In fact, I know I've read some older scriptures, sort of from Gnostic times, probably mostly Neoplatonists, who said that the law of gravity and the convolutions of time are the great ways in which, shall we say, unpleasant powers keep us the law of gravity is one way in which the heaviness of life manifests to us. But you know what? When a certain levels of development and aspiration, and ultimately I think also great intensity of religious experience come about, we have a great big book here written by a very prestigious academic entitled De Flu, where he says the history of the impossible, and where he has collected and analyzed the phenomena of primarily many saints. He had access to many of those records who have in divine ecstasy simply taken off and flown away, and sometimes to incredible long distances. And so I am very, very grateful for the loan of this book, and I want to announce it is truly a staggering book. It's quite entitled De Flu, A History of the Impossible, by Carlos Eyre, who is an active university professor. Is he in Yale? Well, you know, even though there are all kinds of stupid demonstrations and things going on now in these places, I think you still can't beat Yale, right, and Harvard. So he is at a very good place. He is incredibly studious, and I tell you, there are only two choices, for instance, with this book, and that is to accept it as it is or to run away. But it shows that there is further development, further individuation, further spiritualization of the human, and that these great mystics have frequently had those experiences, and the result of it was the fact even that they defied the law of gravity, which I think is very interesting and very, very great. So take a look at it, and thank you so much for the loan of it. And I will probably extract something there. There are fabulous extracts from Saint Teresa of Avila, from Saint Joseph Cupertino, after whom Cupertino in the good wine country up north is named. You know, these were all the saints that flew. They were praying, they were wanting to ecstasy, and whammo, they went up, you know. There was a very, very fine motion picture about St. Joseph Cupertino years ago called The Reluctant Saint, which I think that the saint was played by Maximilian Schell, if anybody still remembers. It was very funny. He was a Capuchin monk. Here he was in front of the altar saying Mass, two little altar boys behind him, rising up in the air, and the altar boys are holding on to his vestments, trying to pull him down. So let's say very strange and downright unbelievable phenomena can happen once that indwelling divinity has reached its own, and once there are real mystical raptures of the kind that we find among a lot of the saints. But more about all of that later. I hope you weren't bored to death, but I promise you to make it more interesting next time.